Okay, hello, Shakespeareans. Here we are, back in the globe. So, this lecture might not be amazing. I haven't scripted it. I've recorded like a billion lectures today and I am tired. But here we are in Act Two, and I just wanted to pull up the questions that I brought into class a couple weeks ago now. I think the binaries, if you recall, that we started sketching on the board, the difference between nature and the court, and all the different associations with being at court and how there are supposed to be laws there and rules governing your behavior and hierarchies and different stations versus in nature where you think that you can be freer and exercise different sides of yourselves. And so the Duke Sr. and his followers escape out into nature and they seem to be just having a grand old time living like Robin Hood. So the forest in this play becomes an experimental space. And we talked in that class discussion about how actually the binary is not as fixed as we think. That in fact there's more of a spectrum. In fact, once they get to the forest, there are more structures and rules than we might expect. And so we can think about why Shakespeare is doing that or what he's trying to say about society. Possibly in the forest, society is thrown into relief and we can really step back and assess what it is that causes these rules to be created. And there's even forms of currency and that sort of thing. So here, oh, that's probably, you can't read that because it's backward. But there are a number of binaries that are set into conversation in Act Two, such as nature versus court, the ideal world versus the real world, time versus timelessness. And I think this is interesting for us this week because if, like me, suddenly time feels kind of meaningless. I went through most of the day thinking it was Thursday, it's actually Wednesday. I've just been, if you're doing everything at home in front of your computer, you can sort of wake up whenever you want. And so time becomes a very strange concept. And that's kind of what happens in the forest too. I think Duke Sr. says there's no clock in the forest. So in fact, time is a man-made or a human-made invention used to enforce regularity on the courtly world. And we can think about how that affects us. Nature versus nurture is another major binary or set of concepts in this play that's called into question, especially in terms of Oliver versus Orlando, and Orlando as the one who's been deprived of the kind of nurture that would bring him up into high society. Savage versus civilized, so there's a lot of talk between Jakes and the fool that he meets in the forest about what it means to be a civilized person. Fool versus educated person is another binary that's set into play. So it's actually, as we talked about a little bit in class, it's often the fools in these characters who are actually smart or who actually have the freedom to register the wisdom that everyone else is afraid to say because they're so governed by social norms. Laws versus lawlessness. Robin Hood is a character who steals from the rich to feed the poor. So it's a kind of anarchy and or perhaps a communist society if you prefer to think of it that way. So to what extent are the characters in the forest able to break through the laws of the court? Theater versus life, of course, and that comes up with Jake's speech at the end, what it means to be an actor in the world versus a real person, or maybe they're one and the same, an actor on the stage versus the way we act in our everyday lives moving through the world, which I think is actually changing quite drastically this week. And those who talk the talk but who don't walk the walk. So I'll just actually move us to that speech. So kind of hypocrites is what Jakes is often concerned with. This is Act 2, Scene 7, line 75. Whoop, whoop, whoop. 7. Give me a minute. Give you a minute. You should be following along. So Jake's talking to Duke Sr. and he says, why This is around line 72. Why who cries out on pride that can therein tax any private party? So those who, what that sort of means is those who can call out injustice rarely accomplish anything. Those who have the ability to talk can't put their critiques into action. What woman in the city do I name when that I say the city woman bears the cost of princes on unworthy shoulders? So there are a lot of people in the city wearing fancy clothing, and it's impossible to name certain people who are acting as hypocrites because there are so many widespread hypocrisies, is what he talks about here. Jacques is often the one to speak truth to power in a way. He's kind of an advisor. He says, give me leave to speak my mind, and I will through and through cleanse the foul body of the infected world, if they will patiently receive my medicine. That's on the same page, page 77, around line 60. So he's there to comment on society. And that's why it's so interesting, and just a moment that I love when he, in Act 1, so when we open the act, Duke Sr. says, this is our life exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything, which is a line that I love because, as we know later on, Orlando is the one to literally turn trees into books by pasting or fastening his love poetry to the trees, which is a very romantic gesture, IMO, and the books are found in the running brooks in nature. So Duke Sr. and his ilk are out in the forest observing the world around them and finding, and that's what they're reading. They're reading nature. They're reading the forest, sort of literally. Then we have Jacques reading nature on the next page. He is lying by, where is he lying? So this is on line 27. That he, or around line 31, he lay under an oak, so he's by an oak tree, whose antique root peeps out upon the brook that brawls along this wood, to the which place a poor sequestered stag, that is a deer, that from the hunter's aim had ta'en a hurt, did come to languish. And indeed, my lord, the wretched animal heaved forth such groans that their discharge did stretch his leathern coat almost to bursting, and the big round tears cursed one another down his innocent nose in piteous chase. So it's actually a really beautiful image, and this is what I was asking in question number 4 here in the handout that we used in class. This is, by the way, I don't remember if I mentioned page 51 in your books, that we've just seen that the forest is supposed to be a place of leisure, of pleasure, of relaxing and entering into nature. And yet there's a lot of pain in nature. It's kind of a cutthroat environment. And Jacques understands that. In fact, he has a strange connection to nature that I think a lot of other characters don't. So if you picture him by the shore of this brook, watching a deer that's dying, and the deer itself is, when we see this on the gloss on the page 50, there's a common belief in Shakespeare's day that deer weep as they die. So the deer is weeping because the deer is dying. And then Jacques also cries and enters into this scene. Market of the melancholy Jacques stood on the extremest verge of the swift brook, augmenting it with tears. What said Jacques? Did he not moralize the spectacle? And then he kind of becomes this poet or this wise person commenting, poor dear, quoth he, thou makest this a testament as worldlings do, giving thy sum of more to that which had too much, left and abandoned by your velvet friends. Wherefore do you look upon that poor and broken bankrupt there. Thus most invectively he pierced through the body of country city court, yea, and of this our life, swearing that we are mere usurpers, tyrants, and what's worth, to fright the animals and to kill them up in their assigned and native dwelling place. So here, as a herd gallops by, he condemns them for ignoring their dying deer who they should be stopping and caring for. And by offering this commentary on the natural world, he, of course, is also offering a commentary on society for not caring for each other and for allowing certain people to just die. So I really appreciate Jake's, very emotional response to nature and sort of joining with the deer. And we find actually that nature is just as cruel as humanity. Later on, we have Orlando who shows up and expects the Duke to throw him away, partly because he's been banished from the court. And so this is on page 81. Once this Duke Senior is actually very nice to him and says, "Sit down and feed, and welcome to our table. Speak you so gently," Orlando says, "pardon me, I pray you. I thought that all things had been savage here, and therefore put I on the countenance of stern commandment." So he kind of shows up like ready to fight. Like he's gonna steal the food from Duke Senior, and then Duke Senior is actually like, "No, you can join us. We can all be at the table here together." So that's one thing that Orlando has to unlearn about his own expectations. Excuse me. And then I only have a few minutes left in this video, so this is just kind of like a whirlwind trip through Act 2, which hopefully we can talk about more in our class time tomorrow. Duke Senior at this very famous speech, and now I'm on page 83, Act 2, Scene 7, starting at line 142. Duke Senior says to Orlando, "Thou seest we are not all alone unhappy. This wide and universal theater presents more woeful pageants than the scene wherein we play in." So here he's talking about the theater. I mean, he's talking about the theater that they inhabit as the forest, in terms of the forest, but of course the spectators are there. It's the 17th century, and the actors would have gestured around to the globe. And we can maybe talk as a class about what he means when he says it presents more woeful pageants than the scene we play in. What does that mean? And Jake says, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his act being 7 ages." We talked about that way back at the beginning of class and what it means to say that all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. I think he has the sense that humanity is fake, and so much of humanity continues to be fake. You have people branding themselves on Instagram and projecting a certain side of themselves that is absolutely artificial. So, and how do we act differently towards our friends or our buddies versus our boss? Is this reality, or is this kind of just different roles that we're putting on as we move through the world? So I want to chart out the 7 ages here and think about how those ages would be different today, or if you think they're still accurate. First, he says the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. Then second stage, the whining schoolboy who's like begrudgingly going to school, creeping like snail unwillingly to school, which is a great line. So he really does not want to go to school. He's walking so slowly, just like a snail. And then the lover, so this is your teenage years after puberty, and you start to sigh like a furnace and try to woo people, your mistress. And then you become a soldier and you learn about the world. Perhaps in your early 20s, you go off to war and you become very aware of a lot of the problems and the violence and the conflict in society. And then maybe in your 30s or 40s, you become the justice. You're very wise now with all of your experience, full of wise saws and modern instances with severe eyes and a beard of form. I mean, okay, we're just talking about men here. We're not talking about women. And so what would the 7 ages be for women? I have 20 seconds left. The 6th age is the lean and slippered pantaloon, which is a funny word for an old man. And then the 7th age is second childlessness and mere oblivion. So that is actually returning to death. And that is a very creepy way to end this video. Thank you so much for watching.